England, 1199. The bells of Westminster's churches peal, announcing the coronation of a new king. John, the youngest son of the powerful Henry II and the indomitable Eleanor of Aquitaine, ascends to a throne he was never destined to occupy. Born in Oxford on December 24, 1166, he was the fifth son of the royal family, so distant from the crown that his own father gave him the mocking nickname that would follow him through history, John Lackland. By a cruel twist of fate, his older brothers, William, Henry, and Geoffrey, died young, and when Richard the Lionheart, his last obstacle to the throne, succumbed to an arrow wound during the siege of Château de Châlus in April 1199, the improbable occurred. John became King of England. The irony was not lost on the barons and nobles who witnessed his coronation. The man who should never have been king now ruled one of Europe's most powerful kingdoms. Few could have predicted that his reign would be marked not only by the loss of territories and the forced signing of the Magna Carta, but also by a series of personal scandals that would shock even the less than rigorous standards of medieval nobility. For John Lackland was not merely a controversial ruler. He was a man whose lust and cruelty often went hand in hand, a predator who did not hesitate to take for himself the women he desired, even if they already belonged to other men. By the time he ascended the throne, John was already married to Isabella of Gloucester, a distant cousin to whom he had been united for purely political reasons. The marriage, however, produced no heirs, and more importantly for John, it did not provide the strategic alliance he now needed to strengthen his kingdom against the ambitions of King Philip II of France. In 1200, barely a year after his coronation, John saw the perfect opportunity for a new matrimonial alliance. His eyes turned to Isabella of Angoulême, heiress to the strategically important county of Angoulême, a region that controlled crucial routes between Poitiers and Gascony, significantly increasing the king's dominion over Aquitaine. There was just one small problem. Isabella was already promised to another man, Hugh X, Lord of Lusignan, member of one of the most prominent families of Poitiers. In fact, more than promised, the two were already officially engaged, with wedding preparations underway. For John, this presented no obstacle. With the same calculated coldness that would mark his reign, he simply took another man's betrothed. In a bold move, he declared his own first marriage null, claiming that he had not obtained the necessary papal permission to marry Isabella of Gloucester, as they were cousins, a rule he had conveniently ignored years earlier. In August 1200, John Lackland married Isabella of Angoulême. She was barely 12 years old. He was 33. Chroniclers of the time record that Isabella was extraordinarily beautiful, the Helen of her age, according to some. John seemed truly enchanted by her, to the point that, according to contemporary accounts, he had fallen deeply in love. Others, more cynical, point out that it was desire for the strategic lands of Angoulême, more than for the young bride, that motivated the king. For Hugh of Lusignan, the abandoned fiancé, the insult was unbearable. Furious, he and his powerful family declared war on John, initiating a rebellion that would culminate in the loss of almost all English territories in France, the first of many lands that Lackland would ironically lose during his reign. But the episode with Isabella of Angoulême would be just the beginning of John's predatory behavior toward women. At his court, rumors quickly spread that the king respected no one's marriage vows, least of all his own. Contemporary chroniclers record that he frequently seduced the wives and daughters of his barons, sometimes using his power to coerce reluctant women, or simply taking them by force when seduction failed. Roger of Wendover, a monk and chronicler of the time, wrote that John, dishonored through adultery and fornication, the daughters and relatives of his earls and barons whenever it pleased him, adding that he was more a tyrant than a king, more a destroyer than a ruler. But perhaps the most disturbing example of John's predatory nature, and certainly the most historically consequential, was the case involving William de Braos and his wife Matilda. William de Braos was one of England's most powerful barons, lord of vast lands in Wales and the Welsh Marches. Initially, he was one of John's favorites, receiving immense privileges and territories from the king. Matilda de Braos, in turn, was no ordinary woman for her time. Described as beautiful, very wise, fearless, and vigorous, she administered her husband's castles and properties when he was absent. In 1198, Matilda successfully defended Payne's Castle against a massive Welsh attack led by Prince Gwenwynwyn of Powys, holding off enemy forces for 3 weeks until English reinforcements arrived. A woman of such courage and determination was rare in the medieval world. The problems began when, according to various contemporary accounts, John developed an inappropriate interest in Matilda. The king, known for his uncontrollable lust, made advances toward his vassal's wife, advances that were firmly rejected. For a woman like Matilda, with her strong personality and unwavering loyalty to her husband, the king's indecent proposals were not only unwanted, but deeply insulting. The situation took an even darker turn in 1208. William de Braos had witnessed an event that John preferred to keep secret: the murder of his nephew, Arthur of Brittany, the main rival to the throne. Although the exact details are nebulous, accounts suggest that John murdered Arthur with his own hands, or at least directly ordered his death, in 1203. In another example of the cruelty and paranoia that would mark his reign, John demanded that William and Matilda's son be sent to court as a hostage, a guarantee of the family's loyalty. It was at this moment that Matilda de Braos committed the fatal mistake that would cost her and her son their lives. She refused to hand over her son to the king, publicly declaring, "I will not deliver my children to a king who murdered his own nephew." John's reaction was swift and merciless. He declared William de Braos a traitor, confiscated all his lands and properties, and sent troops to capture him along with his family. William and Matilda managed to flee to Ireland, but were eventually captured. While William escaped to France, Matilda and her eldest son were taken prisoner to Corfe Castle. What followed was one of the most barbaric episodes of John's reign. By direct order of the king, Matilda and her son were locked in a dungeon and left to starve to death. 11 days later, when the guards finally opened the cell, they found a scene of indescribable horror. The bodies of mother and son embraced, with Matilda having died, with her head resting on her son's chest. More disturbing still, the son's face bore bite marks, evidence that, in her extreme desperation, Matilda had attempted to keep them alive by any means possible. The brutal death of Matilda de Braos deeply shook the English nobility. If John was capable of such cruelty against the wife of one of his most prominent barons, no one was safe. The case would become one of the catalysts for the barons' rebellion that 7 years later would force John to sign the Magna Carta, the document that limited the powers of the monarchy and established the principle that no one, not even the king, was above the law. Indeed, Clause 39 of the Magna Carta, which states that no free man shall be seized or imprisoned, or stripped of his rights or possessions, or outlawed or exiled, or deprived of his standing in any way, except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land, is directly influenced by John's treatment of Matilda and the de Braos family. John's predatory behavior toward women was not limited to Isabella of Angoulême or Matilda de Braos. Historical records are filled with mentions of his numerous mistresses and the illegitimate children he had with them. A contemporary historian observed that he was almost constantly unfaithful to Queen Isabella, having at least 5 known illegitimate children with various mistresses. Perhaps more disturbing than his own infidelities was the way John used women as pawns in his political games. When he wasn't taking other men's women for himself, he was forcing his mistresses to marry his barons and knights as a form of reward or to seal alliances. A chronicler of the time reported that John gave his concubines in marriage to his mercenaries, transferring them like property between men. In the case of one of his mistresses, a woman known only as Hawise in historical records, John forced her to marry Godfrey de Mandeville, Earl of Essex, in 1214. Godfrey had to pay the king the extraordinary sum of 20,000 marks for the privilege of marrying the monarch's former mistress, an arrangement that demonstrates John's contempt both for the dignity of women and for the honor of his nobles. Behind all these stories of lust and cruelty emerges the figure of a deeply disturbed man whose erratic and often sadistic behavior reflected not only the problematic standards of his time, but also a singularly cruel personality, even by medieval standards. Some modern historians suggest that John suffered from some type of psychological disorder, possibly what we would today call a personality disorder. Others point to his childhood as the least favored son, frequently neglected by his parents. The great King Henry II was almost always absent, involved in wars and affairs of state, while his mother, the formidable Eleanor of Aquitaine, was imprisoned by her own husband during most of John's youth. Whatever the psychological explanation, the historical impact of his conduct was undeniable. John's behavior as a private man reflected his behavior as king: impulsive, cruel, and often self-destructive. The same impulses that led him to take other men's women led him to alienate his barons and lose vast territories to France, culminating in one of the greatest military failures in English history. In 1216, while a civil war ravaged his kingdom, John Lackland contracted dysentery during a military campaign. Weakened by illness and abandoned by many of his followers, he died on October 19th of that year at Newark Castle, an inglorious end for a king whose personal and political life was marked by scandal and disaster. John's death was received with little lamentation. Chroniclers of the time noted that even his closest courtiers seemed more relieved than saddened. Matthew Paris, one of the most important chroniclers of the period, wrote that hell became uglier when John Lackland arrived there. After his death, historical records preserved his memory as one of the most negative among all English monarchs. And although much of this bad reputation stems from his failures as a ruler, the loss of territories, the imposition of excessive taxes, the quarrel with the church that led to excommunication, a significant part derives from his personal behavior, particularly toward women. Ironically, it would be John's son, with Isabella of Angoulême, Henry III, who would inherit the throne and the arduous work of rebuilding the monarchy after the chaos left by his father. And although Henry III was not a particularly brilliant king, he at least avoided the personal excesses that had characterized his father's reign. 800 years later, John Lackland remains one of the most despised monarchs in English history. His legacy is that of a king who not only lost lands and political power, but whose personal conduct revealed the darkest depths of human nature. A king who stole women as he stole lands and riches, with an insatiable greed that would eventually consume him. The story of John Lackland serves as a somber reminder of how absolute power can corrupt absolutely, and of how abuses committed in the most private circles often reflect and amplify abuses of power in the public sphere. A man who treated women as property to be taken would hardly treat his subjects with more respect. Perhaps John's true legacy is not the Magna Carta, a document he was forced to sign and tried to repudiate as soon as possible, but rather The lesson that no ruler, no matter how powerful, is above common morality or the consequences of their actions. John Lackland, the king who stole other men's women, ended up losing everything he valued most: power, respect, and finally, his own kingdom.